How might your life have been different if there was a religion for you? A religion that honored you as a woman, as made equal in the image of God. Welcome to Heretica, her Ecofeminist Theology podcast. My name is Elena and I am an Ecofeminist theologian. Please subscribe at theologyofher.substack.com. Hello, my name is Elena and this is my journey to Ecofeminist theology. You can read more at theologyofher.substack.com. I never set out in life to have metaphysical experiences, but as the Yiddish expression goes, man plans and God laughs. I have learned this to be true. One school day, I must have been age 9, a soft nudge prompted me to lift my gaze up from my homework. Opposite me, and right under our kitchen door threshold, I saw a rainbow color outline of 3 human figures intersecting one another very rapidly. I immediately wanted this to stop, as the buzzing sound in my head I likened to the snow that is heard when a TV is not picking up a signal was very disturbing. I asked for it to stop. After a few seconds it did, and so did the rainbow image. What I can only define as being an out-of-body experience was not, however, my last. A second occurred on my menarche, the first day of my menses. Once again, a touch, as light as a feather, caught my attention, as my mom was describing to me the biological implications of my transition to womanhood. As her voice faded into the background, a tiny light spark caught my attention. Then a whisper which prompted me to take a vow that I would treat my reproductive energy as sacred. Later, as an adult, I would reflect on this moment to realize how it had spiritualized my blood cycle. Throughout my teens, nothing extraordinary occurred. The only very clear memory I have about my thinking during this time was how I wanted to live a harmonious life, the inner life to match the outer, and not project outwards a different reality to what I was experiencing inwards. Say what you mean and mean what you say, a type thing. Things in my life really began to change when aged 23 I moved on my own to Sydney, Australia to study. I had lived the early years of my life in Sydney before my Greek Cypriot parents returned to Cyprus to live permanently. This was for me a chance to experience a different way of life, thinking that my small town living in Cyprus was the sole reason of my life's challenges. After graduating high school, I just wasn't interested in following a linear trajectory of life. Get a job, marry, have children, and a home, and socializing with other families that do the same. I had by then discovered yoga, and I had begun reading esoteric books. I realized I was interested in something else, but what? Things did not go as planned when I moved to the big city. I was still restless and awkward. I once again could not fit in. For a while I thought this was due to the cultural change. I went along with that, immersing myself in my new life, much of which was exploring yoga. After about 8 months of living in Sydney and 6 months into college studying film direction, I dropped out. I continued to justify it as a culture shock. As I continued to immerse myself into the world of yoga, it became my only interest. I spent hours rummaging through second-hand bookstores to get my hands on every book about yoga I could find. Then it was all those hours sitting at the cafe, immersing myself into the teachings over a cup of hot spicy chai, desperately hoping that the next page held the answer to my struggles and I would be free from this suffering. The only literature that soothed my excessively thinking mind, I reflected, were books steeped in yogic philosophy. From the Bhagavad Gita to the Upanishads, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and Bhakti Yoga, my mind would absorb every word with relative ease. It was confronting to realize that the higher teachings of yoga, as the Swami authors would refer to, my mind was ripe for. How can this be so easy for me to understand? I questioned time and time again. But looking at the author's biography and the renunciate journey to yoga, I thought I was making it up. There's no way I can understand the higher teachings so easily, I despaired. Immediately, I would invalidate myself. I would put the books down and try to turn my mind elsewhere, into other interests. I took photography classes, jewelry making, Pilates. I even tried filmmaking again, but to no avail. I was back into yoga and reading ancient texts. It was the only practice that made sense to me, but its impact worried me. Yoga triggered my need to isolate to self-study. By then, Kundalini Yoga, which involved manipulating the breath and chanting, suited my quirkiness, I had decided. But every class triggered more and more thoughts, which resulted in me needing more alone time to deal with it. The more I read, the more I did yoga, the more I wanted to be on my own. Through this existential crisis, I had to wake up every morning, go to my 9-to-5 job, which I disliked, and then come home to read or go to yoga. I also spent my lunch breaks and my time on the bus or train to read to soothe my mind. But the more that went on, the more it troubled me. I didn't move to the other side of the world to live like a recluse, I would self-complain. But my mind began to reach states of bliss as a result of the yogic teachings upon which I would contemplate on, so I just kept on going in this survival mode for years. To self-soothe my chaotic mind, I will go on very long walks and sit in a park, once again with a book in my hand. I had to touch the earth to feel that I existed. I also needed to be around people. The streets gave me that comfort. The sounds, the signs of life around me were necessary for my sanity. Once again, the uneasy feeling of where is my life going would settle in, and I desperately wanted to fit in, to be like everyone else. I would try again a few times to break free from the spiritual path, but I couldn't. Yoga just drew me in more and more. At times, the emotional and mental turmoil was anguish. The inner chaos was so intense that at times I thought something inside of me would just snap and I would literally die. But before every rebirth there is a death, and there were many for me. I likened this to going through the ringer, whereby every cell of my body was washed and squeezed to expel every single impurity contained, time and time and time again. In addition to Kundalini Yoga, I sought hope in other religions. I explored Kabbalah, Buddhism, Wicca, Theosophy, and other yoga traditions like Hatha Yoga and Iyengar Yoga. I did everything to escape my religious upbringing of Orthodox Christianity. The Immaculate Conception, Jesus' crucifixion, Virgin Motherhood, they made no sense. They seemed impossible to attain and pulled my mind into extreme duality and more mental anguish. Yet, as I walked around Sydney, I was drawn to the architecture of Gothic cathedrals, and I would spend time admiring them. Once my gaze would fall on a statue of Mary or Jesus on the facade, I would immediately experience intense awe throughout my whole being. I would be back in love with this essence, unconditionally. And I hated how it brought me back into the impossibility of the Christian teachings. After about 3 years of living betwixt and between despair, hopelessness, doubt, invalidation, and surrender, bliss, and unconditional love, I started to have panic attacks. For months on end, I tried hypnosis and even took magnesium recommended at an organic food store as a muscle relaxant. Nothing worked. Then during a body process, I had an abrupt transformational experience, like an internal explosion, whereby all this energy that caused the panic attacks lifted off me. Consequently, I saw a flash of light for a second. And yes, it was like an orgasm, but it wasn't. It was a much more subtle experience. Once I realized my panic attacks had stopped forever, the relief was tremendous. Yet, knowing my journey thus far, I knew that this was also something else. I stayed with this experience. About a year later, I was still going through more and more incidences of purification. The deity I was always drawn to, or should I say the one that resonated with me the most, was the Virgin Mary in Christianity as a divine goddess, not as the Virgin Goddess or as the Virgin Mother Goddess. That still confused me. Because my esoteric experience with her put me in such a crisis, I tried to get rid of this association. Yet, after this awakening, it was as if this deity had latched onto me. In an invisible way, she was always in front of me, always in my awareness. As if sitting on the tip of my nose, she was always there before I was, at my every turn. Finally, this dissipated when in December 2008, I saw a vision of her. I had returned to Cyprus for my nephew's baptism, when between wake and asleep I saw a vision similar to Byzantine iconography. At the end of this vision, I saw the Eucharist cup. Returning to Sydney, I realized that there was a part of me frozen from the aftershock of the event. Life, though, even after many inner journeys and spiritual awakenings, didn't become easier. Even so, I began to contemplate what to do with these experiences. Then during a yoga class, while holding a restorative pose, the teacher began to recite a poem connected to the Bhakti devotional tradition of yoga, which I explored for years as I realized I was devotional to the sacred naturally. It was the first time that I had experienced such deep religiosity in an asana class. I surrendered to the pose unconditionally. Being innately devotional in nature, I was inspired by this moment. I decided to train to become a yoga teacher. I began mid-2009. During this training and while exploring the concept of samadhi, the final stage of intense meditation leading to union with the divine, the yoga teacher mentioned how usually a yogi may first see a vision and then have a kundalini awakening, or the reverse, have a kundalini awakening and then see a vision. While I had toyed with the idea of kundalini awakening as my experience that ceased my panic attacks, I was hesitant to admit it to myself until then. I realized that having seen a vision, what preceded that was my kundalini awakening. Finally, light at the end of the tunnel, I thought. Yet I still hoped I could share my story with a guru for that expert verification. I began sharing it one day with my kundalini yoga teacher when I bumped into her in the street. Midway I stopped as I saw her begin to laugh. From that first attempt, I decided to just keep it to myself for a little bit longer. During my yoga teacher training, mentions of an ashram 2 hours away from central Sydney gorged my curiosity. Up until then, I thought that ashrams only existed in India. I decided to book a volunteer stay in December 2009. Mangrove Yoga Ashram, as it was known back then, now it doesn't exist because of the Me Too movement, was a transforming experience. It was also the first time I had heard the term Mahasamadhi. The guru of the ashram, Swami Satyananda, had made the decision to consciously leave his body. Upon return from the ashram, I was inspired to seek my own guru. I went through every yoga tradition and urban ashram in my area, but nothing. None of them felt right. I returned to Satyananda Ashram about a year later to attend a women's spirituality weekend. One of the female teachers, Swami Satyadharma, who has also left her body, shared with us her own spiritual journey to India, how she traveled to India, and once she met Swami Satyananda around age 18, she knew he was her guru and gave up everything to serve at the ashram. call to her spiritual journey from such a young age, I related to it, and when I returned home, I decided to write to her, hoping she could be the one to shed light on my own journey. Within 20 pages of a new journal, I outlined my experience and posted it to her. I never heard back. While in 2013, I did get initiated by Swami Satsangi, the closest female disciple to Swami Satyananda, after a few years that connection dissipated. Having returned to Cyprus, the small yoga scene felt like I would be starting all over again, something that made no sense, so I kept up my asana practice privately. By 2019, I began questioning again what I could do with my experiences. I did begin writing a memoir book mirroring my experiences to the teachings of yoga as a way to ground them and provide the readers with insight of praxis. That is how the theory can translate into lived experience. But something always felt amiss. As a student of Ayurveda, I had always remembered Mother Maya from Wise Earth Ayurveda, stating how we need to stay connected to our culture for good health. Having immersed myself into the Indian culture for so long, I had completely lost connection with my Greek Cypriot heritage. I decided to change that. Gradually, I started to have a deep desire to go back to school and complete a master's degree. It boiled down to two themes: religious studies or gender studies. Unable to decide which of the two I preferred, I wondered if somehow I could combine both. The results of an online search of the keywords feminism and theology was a big surprise. Feminist theology was already an academic discipline. I felt that I was closer than ever to piecing the pieces of my life story together. That moment was amplified when I began reading literature related to feminist theology. The highlight was the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Due to her being the first witness of Christ's resurrection through a vision, Mary Magdalene became known as the Apostle of Apostles. The realization that Mary Magdalene was not the prostitute I was always told she was, but the first person and a woman to see a vision of Jesus, was a profound moment. That began to validate my own experience more and more, that women can have visions, and I started to build a more confident inner resolve. I also started to question, what other religious untruths have I been told and why? In 2020, I began my 2-year master's degree in contemporary religious studies, where I read existential health and feminist theology. The journey took me into the matriarchal culture of Minoan Crete, the women's priesthoods of ancient Greece, and into contemporary feminist theologians' writings who acknowledged the patriarchal harm of traditional Christian tradition on women's experience of religion, and were interpreting Christianity and more through a feminist lens. Weaved through these women's religious experiences were their reverence for nature, the goddess, fertility rituals, and the life-giving act of advocating for Imago Dei, born in the image of God for all women. Importantly, through the ancient Greek practice of parthenogenesis, or otherwise divine birth, aka yogic tantra, I was able to begin to tie my own experiences to my culture. The more I read, the more I was able to see similar yogic patterns and teachings in ancient Greece, and that gave me the cultural grounding I needed. Through ecofeminism and feminist biophilia, my relationship with nature began to deepen, and my metaphysical religious experiences, whose transcendent nature challenged my connection to my body, allowed me to now integrate body, mind, and spirit. While in hindsight, the absolute of transcendence is required to eventuate as a vision, without nature, this journey is not possible. On my journey towards transcendence, the earth gave me the primordial energy to continue and soothe my body to sustain the tensions. On my journey back to the finite, after I saw a vision, she was there waiting for me to help me integrate into wholeness. In this new consciousness, I became vegan and my compassion towards nature and animals amplified. The journey has taught me how much women's experience of self-realization has been oppressed. Similarly, ecology, wildlife, and farm animals are suffering because of this disconnection, which has given permission to the elitist mentality of exploitation and domination. I am convinced that a religious equality that recognizes both men and women as divine and as God and Goddess will enable us to resurrect from the root this destruction, because when we have spiritual experiences, they change the way we see life. We see the invisible which exists in all life, and that includes God as a woman. Thank you for listening, and please do subscribe for more at theologyofher.substack.com. How might your life have been different if there was a religion for you? A religion that affirmed you as a woman, as equal to man, and made in the image of God. How might your life have been different? Heretica, her Ecofeminist Theology educational podcast.